Ahoy! I'm very excited for today's video because I may have stumbled across a very overpowered mechanic in New World. And this is tied to Constitution, a stat that was already considered relatively overpowered for PvP before this. I stumbled across this while testing different defense values to see how much defense gives you how much damage reduction, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how much defense is really worth building for you, and what this broken mechanic is and how this affects your defense value as well. Before we get started, a big thank you to Seventh for testing this with me in-game so that I could get these numbers, and to Flairboot for having a quick look over these numbers as well. Now I will try and keep this as simple and understandable as possible, but we can have a quick look at this graph just to understand what we're working with here. These are a bunch of tests that I ran wearing either no gear or just a helmet and pants, or full white armor with no extra stats, or my full gear with stats on it. And then I tested that with various levels of Constitution, which provides you with extra health and other beneficial stats. The graph that you're seeing there was already corrected for a few things. For example, the person I was playing against had a perk that would increase their damage by 10% if my health was above 50%, so sometimes the damage numbers were a bit inconsistent, but I could fix all that, and I could also avoid things like reduced damage that I get for having too much Constitution by taking a few extra hits in between. That was all fine. But still, a lot of the numbers didn't end up making sense. They were inconsistent. And I controlled for pretty much anything I could think of. I was always hit by the first hit of the attack chain, for example, so it couldn't have been that, and I just couldn't figure out what the problem was. Therefore, I decided to highlight the numbers that didn't make sense to me. And the only thing they all had in common was that these were the builds with more or equal to 195 Constitution. We'll get back to that. First, how did I even figure out that these were the numbers that didn't add up and not that the others were wrong? Reddit user Ashkan or Ashkan, big shout out to them, posted their own numbers tested in PvE on a lower level a few days ago. And their stats looked as follows. With no armor, they had no damage mitigation. Makes sense. With 106 armor, they had 10% damage mitigation. With 247 armor, they had 20% damage mitigation. And with 353 armor, they had 27% mitigation. This went up and up, you can see the numbers here, until they had 800 armor for 45% damage mitigation. The resulting damage formula for that is surprisingly simple. It is the armor value divided by, open brackets, armor value plus 1000, brackets closed. Simple enough so far, and unfortunately it doesn't stay quite that simple. This is a formula that would mean that if you have 1000 armor, you would end up with 50% damage reduction or damage mitigation. In other words, when you have 1000 armor, you take half the normal damage. And even though Ashkan or Ashkan had tested this in PvE, the damage output seemed to stay consistent in PvP, and my values for many levels of Constitution were pretty similar. For example, when I had full white armor for 541 physical defense, I got 37% damage mitigation, whereas realistically, according to the calculation, I should have had 35%. Now, sometimes there are small rounding errors, sometimes there are other effects on items or something else that has to be factored in somewhere. That is something I can live with. That is just the margin of error that these types of tests work with sometimes. But two things didn't add up here. Before we get into that, a quick reminder, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. It helps me out greatly. I will make a video about Constitution and strength scaling for PvP very soon, so if this type of stuff is up your alley, there's more to come. Once we went to 195 Constitution, somehow I had damage mitigation that shouldn't be there on the early ranks, and then when I put on my full gear, I actually had less damage mitigation than I should have had according to the formula. I did a bunch of digging and I couldn't figure out what caused this, because I thought it was something related to armor, maybe armor weight or something, but none of that made a difference. I had put on a shield to get into a higher weight class and that made no difference. The only thing that was there that didn't really change between them was the Constitution going above 150. There are two perks that you receive on 150 Constitution. One of them is just a decrease in weight of logging items, which is entirely irrelevant. And the other one is minus 10% crit damage taken. However, most of the attacks that I was hit by weren't crits, and when they were crits, I specifically did multiple tests for that. And in hindsight, I was lucky having done those tests, because that's where the answer was. I had one scenario where I had 105 constitution and 541 armor, and I was hit by a crit. Through that, I was able to figure out the crit multiplier, which varies a little bit depending on what gear you have, and that was 1.54 in this case. That by itself is not that important. But I did another test with the same armor and the same amount of constitution where I didn't get crit. So I knew the relative ratio and I knew how much damage these two hits were meant to deal in comparison. And then I had a similar scenario at my full gear, when I had my 256 constitution and I had my 1593 armor. Again, in both cases this was across multiple hits to avoid the effect from 250 constitution, but that aside, what I realized was that the crit value didn't decrease according to the 10% reduction that it should have taken. Obviously the crit deals more damage than the normal hit in any scenario, but it should have been further reduced in comparison by 10%, and putting the numbers side by side and applying the multiplier, that didn't happen. They dealt the same amount of damage and had the same amount of mitigated damage. But again, all numbers above 195 were off. The reason wasn't that the crit passive wasn't working, the reduction was applied. It was the opposite. The reduction wasn't just applied to crit, it was applied to everything. And it's safe to assume that this was the case for most of the beta. I don't know if it affected only melee or also ranged, but it meant that everyone who was building above 150 constitution, which a lot of people were, had more damage mitigation than they were intended to have. As far as I can tell, this mitigation wasn't additive, but rather a flat reduction. So you had to take the original damage value and just go minus 10% from the start before factoring anything else in. In this case, instead of dealing 852 damage, every attack would deal 766 damage. With this reduction applied, our numbers finally started to make more sense. 105 armor would now provide the 9.4% mitigation, and 541 would provide 37.2%, which is very close to the numbers we would get from the formula. But one number still doesn't make sense, and that is the one for 1593 physical defense. Here we have a total of 53.3% damage mitigation, but according to our calculation we should already have 50% at 1000 defense, so almost 600 defense more would only provide an extra 3.3%. According to the formula that we used so far, it should be 61.4%. I regret not doing another test at exactly 1000 defense, but what I think is happening here is that there is some sort of mitigation diminishing returns the higher you go in defense. Meaning the more armor you build, the less damage mitigation you get for it. This may start below 1000 already at a smaller scale, or this may just kick in right at 1000 and then pick up very heavily, but either way it seems that there is some point where you're getting closer to a cap and it might not be worth stacking that much defense anymore. I won't be able to figure out the exact numbers for that for now, but here is a little graph to show you what we know so far about defense scaling and how it scales lower the higher you go. That said, please don't take this as, oh, I should never build more than 1000 defense then. Because there are other things at play here that we need to factor in as well, such as the result of the health and the defense being the effective health, which can kind of skew this in a different direction as well. This is something I'll look at more closely on release when I can do some more tests with different levels of gear, and we also have some more bug fixes for things like this extra negation that we probably shouldn't have all the time. Again, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified of those types of videos when they come out, so that you stay informed, and if you're generally interested in other New World videos as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.